In the past year, European citizens have sacrificed an unprecedented amount of liberties and gave their governments a wide range of possibilities to limit their freedoms even further and to bypass basic democratic processes. Of course, this was necessary to save lives. But now that the rules are being relaxed, where should we be going to? The relaxation comes with new conditions and limitations: tests, COVID certificates, quarantines, tracing apps, etc. In some countries, you even need your COVID pass just to go to a cafe. At what point do these restrictions go from being a necessary inconvenience that enable our freedoms to disproportionately limiting our liberal values? And how do we find the balance in the likely scenario that the pandemic becomes endemic? Just as we ask ourselves, how can we build back better our economies? In this session, we ask ourselves, how can we build back stronger our freedoms and democracies? And what is the liberal promise to safeguard our freedoms and our democracies? And in this session, we have a panel discussion. Before that, we have asked 3 liberal leaders to give a speech on their thoughts, and we will end with Commissioner Reynders with his ideas and plans in the European Commission. But of course, we also want to hear your voice in this debate, so please go to slido.com, enter the code. There you can ask all your questions, upvote other questions, give comments, but also we'll ask some polls. Beatriz, what is the first question we ask our audience?
The first question we want to ask our audience is, what should be the most important priority for the liberals when fighting a crisis such as the COVID-19 crisis? And we want to hear your views and share them very quickly with our panelists today.
Yes, you can rank them in order. You can rank equipping our authorities while not endangering our liberties, safeguarding our democracies, and maintaining the trust of our citizens. So far, what do people think, Beatriz?
So far, we have the first one is equipping our authorities while not endangering our liberties. That's the main priority that should be for our liberal leaders indeed. Then safeguarding our democracies, and then recovering citizens' trust. I don't know how I feel about this one, and I'm looking forward to hearing our speakers. If you want to participate in this Slido polling, but also to share your questions, I'm going to remind you the code is 8702. Make sure that you share your thoughts with us.
Yes, great. And here to welcome us is the former leader of the Flemish party Open VLD, a minister since October, and since October he's the Prime Minister of Belgium, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Alexandru de Croo. Good morning, Mr. de Croo.
Good morning, everyone. Are you hearing me loud and clear?
Loud and clear. Yes, please share with us your thoughts of what is the liberal promise to safeguard our freedoms and democracies.
Well, thank you, and I'm extremely happy to participate in this ALDE Congress, still from a distance, but I've seen that already quite some people are physically in Brussels. So this is reflecting the fact that that things are starting to go better. I think Europe as a whole is starting to go better after a bit of a hesitant start of the vaccination rollout. We see that our confidence is growing, and confidence actually on the business and on the consumer side is, if you look at it in Belgium, it's at the highest point since 2007, which is actually quite remarkable. And it is, I think, a reflection of something that we have done well. I think the medical part and the economic part, Europe has shown that if we get our minds into something, we can get things done. And we get it done on this historic resilience and recovery fund of more than €1 trillion. We get it done on the fact that such a large part of the vaccination worldwide is being done, produced in Europe. And that we have had no problem at all from the start to share what we do in Europe with the rest of the world. So that part, if we get our mind to it, as I said, we can get a lot of things done. And that is why I think that the topic on democracy and freedom is so important, because in contrast to the economic rebound, I would say that the state of democracy and the state of the rule of law in Europe is actually in quite a dire state. Like the coronavirus, we see that autocratic tendencies on our continent are quite contagious, and they are spreading from one member state to the other. And as we have been effective in stopping the spread of the virus, we should also be as effective in stopping the spread of this. Not because this would limit our capacity to act abroad, but also because I'm really convinced that this is undermining our solidarity and it's undermining our cohesion in the union. And this type of undermining in the union should be brought to a full stop. To guarantee the freedom of speech, to guarantee the freedom to protest, to make sure that courts are independent, and even more important, to protect the rights of minorities. Because I think that if democracy is successful at something, it is not so much the opinion of the majority, it is being able to protect the opinion and taking into account the opinion of minorities. That is really, for me, the quality sign of a well-functioning democracy. And if we look throughout Europe, there's a lot of red lights. If I look in Hungary, a prime minister has filled a legal text that will make it practically impossible to even discuss LGBTI rights. But let's not be mistaken. In my view, this is not a story of the East versus the West, whereby everything is to blame on the East and the West is free of all charges. I think this would actually be quite a lazy analysis, and I don't think this is going to help us to come to a solution. I really think that defending democracy and democracy in itself is actually quite defenseless. So you need people who are standing up to defend democracy. I really think this is for us the most important fight. An important fight that, for example, someone like Sophie and Veld does every day. And I admire her a lot for her unrelenting campaigns, not only in the streets of Warsaw or Moscow, where she attends gay prides, but above all in the European Parliament, where she is fighting this protection of this defenseless democracy, the way I just called it, and where she fought for and she won on the rule of law mechanism, and where she rightly saw the injustice that we have budgetary discipline in our union, but no democratic discipline. I mentioned Sophie. There's many others, such as Katalin Cseh, fighting exactly the same fight in Hungary, and of course Didier Reynders and Věra Jourová fighting the same fight in the Commission. And I will conclude by that is why I am a proud member of the European liberal family. You can count on myself to do my part of the work as well. I wish all of you a very productive and interesting Congress, especially in this very important session. And I hope that the next time we have a Congress, we can finally do it in person, because in general, things go better when we meet each other and we can hug from time to time.
Thank you so much, Mr. de Croo. You spoke some really ambitious words about safeguarding our democracies. Are these times, because we're so focused on our safety, a danger for democracies, or are we now so thinking about our liberties that maybe this is an opportunity to bring democracy further?
I think that this has been, these have been testing times for freedom, for democracy. And we have to agree that from time to time, we had to take some shortcuts. But in my view, this is not illiberal. I mean, I think we were in a situation where we were brought back to what really is the essence of liberalism and what really is the essence of democracy, and that is that there is a connection between us, and making sure that connection is in balance with our own individual liberties. I think that debate will help us to make it even clearer, to make it even stronger on what exactly it is to be a liberal and what exactly it is to be in a liberal democracy. And of course, we've seen during this crisis that some countries with more authoritarian regimes were sometimes faster in starting certain things. For example, vaccination campaigns and so on. But if you look a bit in the long run, we're catching up. and we're catching up in the right way. So I think the approach we had in Europe was the right approach. And I think the approach where from the start we said, look, we will play our role in the world and we will not revert to policies like we've seen with America First and so on. We've been criticized on this at the start. But if you look at where we stand today, I think we were right.
Wonderful. Well, let's get started with that debate that you think is so necessary. Thank you so much, Mr. Croo, and see you next time in person. And next is joining us the former Minister of the Czech Republic and second-term European Commissioner, member of the party anno 2011, Vice President of the European Commission for Values and Transparency, Věra, Jourová.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's a very great pleasure to participate again in the ALDE family event. And we are distant, but I think we are close. And I hope next time we can meet in person and discuss in one room, feeling what, not only seeing what we think about the important matters together on one place. Well, Alexandra outlined very clearly where we are now. I started in the Commission in 2014, and I remember the naive times when we thought that democracy, fundamental rights, and rule of law will defend itself, that it will be forever, the end of history. This is automatic. Everybody recognizes that this is the best thing we can do and we can have. And unfortunately, over time, we see more and more that these values have to be defended and promoted every day and at every front. It cannot be only for the Commission. I was named by Politico, I think last year, to be a lonely sheriff. Well, I don't feel like that. But when you realize how important, how essentially important values we speak about, this must be the job for everyone, for the Commission, for the Parliament, for its political fractions, for the member states, but also for the citizens, because if the people do not trust that democracy works for them, and that a liberal democracy works for them, we will lose. We will lose the people, and we will lose the chance to keep this kind of governance. And COVID, as Alexandra mentioned, and also the moderator at the beginning, is a stress test for health, for economy, but also for our democratic order, because we saw many doubts and heard the doubts that those countries which are not so democratic can manage better this kind of crisis. And I'm very glad that now we showed that also the vaccination goes well. The COVID passport or the COVID certificate, which we designed very carefully in the Commission, not to create the first and second category of citizens, not to introduce any kind of discrimination. I think this is also the evidence that we are able to face and fight against this kind of crisis, and that we can get soon into the post-COVID time when we will have to also use in the proper way all the measures started, and especially the recovery funding, which should help the people and again help also the society to survive as the society with the values. So I think that we are in a very, very key time now. If I can say more about the COVID pandemic, you remember the Commission has insisted from the outset that the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic must respect our fundamental principles and values. We have been closely monitoring the measures taken by the member states in the fight against the pandemic. And I know that many of you were very vigilant about that too. And we will reflect the emergency measures taken by the member states now in our second rule of law report, which we will publish, I think, on the 20th of July, so very soon. now that many member states have arrived at the stage of phasing out certain COVID-19 measures, we are at a crucial moment to ensure that this is done in line with the fundamental values of the European Union. So the day of truth will only come. I always said we will see whether COVID hasn't demolished some important features of our democracy after the COVID pandemic, because now we have to see that the member states are coming back to the kind of normality while the checks and balances are fully functioning again. As liberals, we are always, and we must be on the side of the people, on the side of freedoms. And we have to resist the urge to come up with solutions that sound good, but go against these principles. And the recovery funding is a huge chance for Europe. I have already mentioned it before. Chance for the people, a chance for the member states, for businesses. Our direction is clear, to design it with a clear vision towards a greener and more digital future. But also we have to ensure that we do not build back the same, that we build back better. And we must not increase the divisions in the society. Gender stereotypes should not be deepened, and we rather need to use the money for a push towards a more equal and inclusive society. And this is not just a phrase from my side, because believe me, we have been working several months intensively to push the recovery strategies in the direction where they include the measures funded by the EU money to help those who are in deepest troubles and not to, as I said, deepen the inequality in our society. So I really hope that in 2025 or 6, when the recovery funding will come to an end, we will see that we did the right thing by being also vigilant about the fair distribution of this money. I do not have to convince anyone in our family that rule of law and media freedom are the bedrock of democracy. The ALDE family is the most dedicated political force to uphold and defend these European values on the European scene. And I think this is a great opportunity for me to thank you for that. And I will use my role in the Commission to ensure that the Commission is your ally in this endeavor. Thanks to your support, we have advanced the rule of law agenda to unprecedented levels. I told you that I remember times when we didn't see any special need to defend stronger the rule of law. Now we see the need very clearly. We have to use all the tools available. We have the infringements. We have the rule of law report, which seems to be really very useful and practical preventive instrument. And we will use the budget conditionality. I will come to it in a minute. On infringements, we now are in the situation after several won cases in the European Court of Justice. And this was very important because we needed the European Court of Justice to have a say on the definition of the rule of law, on the definition of the EU competencies also in this field. So our infringement actions clearly marked the red lines and our determination to act. Just think about the disciplinary chamber in Poland or the recent cases of Klub Radio or the NGO law in Hungary. I'm looking at Katalin. She will always tell you this is not enough. I agree. The problem is that we cannot cure all the rule of law problems by means of infringements. But we are fulfilling our role and using the infringements whenever we have a solid legal basis to do that. In this context, and now I refer back to what Alexandru said to show that this is not East-West issue, I think the launch of the infringement procedure against Germany last week is marking point because it proves that we will act wherever we see the breach. And we are blind to the national colors of the risks. The decision of the court, Supreme Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe was really the decision which might cause eradicating of the basic principle of the EU, where the last word is said in Luxembourg by the European Court of Justice. So we have to act, and we are acting. I have spoken about the rule of law report, where we are focusing on all EU member states. We received good feedback from 25 out of 27 member states, and we will continue to do so. Let me mention the new regulation on the general regime of conditionality. I know that there is a heated debate in the Parliament recently about it, so I would like to take this opportunity to share with you where we are on this in the Commission. I remember well when I said it first publicly that we should condition the money by the rule of law. It was in 2017 in Vienna. It seemed to be a big scandal to come, because nobody could imagine that we could go that far. And yet here we are. And the huge credit goes to you and the European Parliament for having the regulation in force. Just 6 months ago, where two countries were threatening to veto the MFF and the recovery fund of this regulation, the Parliament did not blink, and we managed to have this regulation adopted without changing a comma. And it is applicable since the 1st of January. No case will be lost. In the Commission, we have started working on it from day one. And I am aware and I appreciate that you are impatient to see the result of this work. And I can assure you that I also want to use this instrument, but we cannot afford any mistakes here. The regulation is an unprecedented tool, and let me stress, we will need the Council to actually use it effectively. It is not the Article 7 which requires unanimity, but still we need a qualified majority to adopt the measures. So we will have to be very clear and very precise. We need to create clarity and predictability on the application of this regulation. And I am sure this is important both for the Parliament and the Council, but also for the beneficiaries of the funds, which according to the regulation should be protected as well. So this is the reason why we will share with the Parliament and Member States the draft guidance on how this regulation will be applied next week for consultation, and then we will formally adopt them later in the Commission. Also, of course, we are working on concrete cases on the screening for potential violations of the regulation. We are working very closely with a very, very strong feeling of collegiality and a really strong interest to come with the proper result, which will not be easy to put into doubt, with Geo Han. So I always say that we are working on it, the people of values and the people of money. We work together on that. Once the Commission has reasonable grounds to consider that the conditions for the application of the regulation are fulfilled, we will launch this tool by sending a written notification to the member state concerned. As for the timing, I am doing everything to do this in early autumn. Of course, we are mindful of the court case in front of the ECJ, and we will take the ruling into account once it comes. But I want to give you my assurance that we will not at this moment wait for the ECJ ruling, because it seems to come too late for us. Last point, as you know, we adopted the European Democracy Action Plan and important legislation covering the digital world, the Digital Services Act, and the Democracy Action Plan, which contains the work against disinformation. I think this is extremely key issue for the liberals as well, because we have to protect the freedom of speech. I do not want to start any process which will end up with authorizing somebody to say what is the lie and what is the truth. It must not happen in Europe. And here comes my instinct of somebody who lived in communist regime. I remember well the only ordered opinion. So we are now working together with the platforms and advertising industry on upgrading the code of practice against disinformation. I would like to feel and hear your endorsement and agreement with the approach we are taking, that this must not be censorship. This must be whole of society effort to keep internet and the platforms better protected against harmful disinformation, which means more fact-checking and more broad debate on internet. Ladies and gentlemen, I know I speak too long, but I just wanted to tell you that I am fully on the side of liberal values. I am the first ever commissioner. How to say?
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Commissioner. And it's very clear your eagerness for the Commission to be allowed not only to bark when our freedoms are endangered, but also to really bite. Thank you so much and good luck with your mission.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and as a last welcome remark, we have the former leader of the Democratic Party of Luxembourg and now the Prime Minister of Luxembourg since 2013, Xavier Bettel.
Friends from ALDE, I'm so sorry, not only because I'm not able to be present physically and directly and have to record the message, but it's the fact that we are not able to exchange, to see each other, to hug, to have a drink, to have a coffee, to exchange. This is what always makes our congresses such a success and such an emotional moment, being able to see what has happened the last 12 months between all of us. We had to give to an exceptional situation exceptional solutions to. As in other countries, we had to take special situations, what we call the emergency state in Luxembourg. We did that at the beginning of the pandemic. But this was exceptional, and this shouldn't be a permanent solution. Not to go to Parliament, not to exchange, as I said before, and to take special rules should be an exception in all democracies. We had this emergency of state just during 3 months, where we were able as government to take faster decisions, and it was at the beginning of the pandemic. Afterwards, we decided that every 3 weeks approximately, we have to go to Parliament. We have to have a democratic exchange. We have to have the democratic controls. This is how it should be. It should be the rule that normal legislative procedure is the way we should live. To say to press that they are not able to do the work because of restrictions, that we say to people that are not able to demonstrate because of restrictions, and etc., cannot be the rule. It has to be the exceptions. And it's we, as liberals, we do not fight for that, then we are not liberals. So I wish to all of you a great exchange. I hope to see you soon, even in, not in WebEx, but being able to hug all of you and to have this exchange. And why I'm not here is because I'm in Parliament. I have a debate in Parliament about the new COVID restrictions or easing the COVID restrictions. But this was my rendezvous every 3 weeks. And I'm proud of that. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister, and good luck with your debate today. I'm going to introduce our panel, and we're going to ask them all one question. If we, in 2050, we would look back at this period, 2021, 2025, how did we in Europe, in your dreams, use the post-COVID-19 time to strengthen our freedoms and democracy? So not only reinstall them, but really strengthen them. And the first I'm going to ask this to the Minister of Justice of Lithuania and representing, I hope you can pronounce this, Laisvės partija, Evelina Dobrovolska. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Evelina, yeah, in 2015, if we look back in your dreams, in a few words, how would we have used this time wisely?
So for me, freedom and democracy is an issue of trust. As Jourová already said, pandemic has heavily impacted that trust. Things that were taken for granted, like freedom of movement or even freedom of speech, were time restricted, and now we must build trust back. I want to make 2 points on this regards. First, Schengen should be equipped to withstand any future pressure. Crisis planning, crisis response teams, our response as a union, not individually, needs to strengthen the Schengen Agreement, not to weaken it. And second, it is absolutely crucial to have a European-wide measure to tackle disinformation and fake news, as Vera Jourová already said as well. We need to have evidence use increased and disinformation and fake news during the pandemic. Countering disinformation and countering hate speech, we are required to use scalpel, no sledgehammer in protecting the freedom of speech. We must recognize that non-democratic regimes in our neighborhood, especially in Lithuania, are the threat to all EU. They use hate speech and disinformation as a tool to fight with our unity and the principle of rule of law. So I hope when we look back on the current challenges through the lens of time, we will be remembered as those that embraced more cooperation and unity in Europe.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And next I introduce from Uniunea Salvatia, Romania, the Secretary of State of the Romanian Ministry of Justice, Alexandra Dimitriu. Alexandru,
Hello,
yeah.
I'm Alexandru Dimitriu. I'm happy to be here and talk to you about the situation in Romania and about the way we struggle to strengthen the rule of law and the main liberal values and principles. Regarding to your question, in 2050, we will be able to look back and say that fundamental rights and democracy have been strengthened by the very degree of damage they suffered during the pandemic. When certain rights are temporarily restricted in order to protect more important and significant rights and freedoms, such as the right to life and the right to health, democracy shows its efficiency. In no democracy do we find all rights and freedoms as absolute and unconditional. There will always be a hierarchy between our fundamental rights and freedoms. According to this hierarchy, at any time one of our rights or freedoms is threatened, the government, the political forces, must be prepared to act and defend it. Our constitutions and the EU treaties and regulations form now a solid basis and allow the governments to react quickly, efficiently, and by trying to affect as less as possible our other rights and freedoms in the process. Thus, it was very important that the EU strengthened the rule of law and began to penalize the member states that distanced themselves from the rule of law standard, be it in the context of pandemic or before the crisis. The success of the vaccination process and the return to normalcy since the beginning of 2021 has shown that democracy is functional, including in situations of health crisis. Thank you.
Joining us, the deputy chairman of the Freie Demokratische Partei in the Deutsche Bundestag and ALDE party vice president, Alexander Graf Lambsdorff.
Hi there. Good to see you all, if only on a screen. I think 3 lessons should be drawn. 1, there is always a balance to strike between liberty and protection. And as liberals, our lesson that we should draw is that our priority should be on liberty, on life chances, on dreams realized, while at the same time recognizing our responsibility for the protection of the population. We must never give in to the authoritarian temptation, saying that you cannot strike a balance and everything has to be decided by the government. But we should also not give in to the libertarian temptation, saying that it's not possible to strike a balance and freedom trumps everything at all times. That is simply not realistic. The second lesson, I think, there should be a better balance between the national level and the European level. We must create European competences in the field of health. A pandemic, by its very nature, crosses borders, is a pan-European event, but the European level was woefully under-equipped in terms of competences and experience when the pandemic struck. And my last lesson that I would like us to draw is looking at Europe and looking at the world. We must be a continent that shines as a beacon, as an example to other parts of the world. So we should strengthen the United Nations, we should strengthen COVAX, we should help the Global South trying to beat the pandemic as well.
Thank you so much, Alexander. And next is joining us the MEP for the Dutch D66, Sophie in Veld.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Good to see you on screen. Maybe I'm working every day for democracy, the rule of law, and fundamental rights. But maybe I would like to make a few philosophical remarks rather than go into to policy files, because And it actually responds quite nicely to what Alexander just said, because maybe we should also look a bit more critical at ourselves, liberals, because we are talking a lot about freedom, but and that's of course economic freedom. But when we are talking about individual freedoms, I note that even we liberals have sometimes been busy building what we call big government. We are building a society very much driven by distrust, concerns, fear, and we have seen in the Netherlands what that can lead to, where the Dutch tax authorities have for years been engaging in ethnic profiling because they assumed certain people would be committing fraud with social security. It became a big scandal. Tens of thousands of people have been badly affected. And I'm sure that there are other examples of such excesses because we have built control systems based on distrust. I also note that in our daily lives, we are getting used to losing the little freedoms. It is more and more difficult to just move about freely, going about your business, more difficult to be different, to step outside the mold, because if we're living in a world ruled by algorithms, then we have one norm, and everybody who doesn't meet the norm is different, and therefore, we're looking at them with some distrust. So I would actually like to argue not only for freedom, but also more trust, curiosity, embrace diversity, embrace being different. And I hope that by 2050, we'll have a society that is based on trust, that is based on confidence in ourselves, confidence in society, and confidence in each other. And then I'm sure we will also automatically embrace freedom again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And lastly, I welcome MEP for the Hungarian Momentum Movement and Renew Vice President, Katalin Cseh.
Thank you very much. And it's really good to be here, even virtually. And, I believe that actually experiencing loss can make us appreciate what we already have. And quite paradoxically, this crisis can give us the strength and energy to breathe new life into our democracies. But for that, I think we also have to confront on just how much our democracies suffered in this period. And if we look into this question, there are so many ways this pandemic hurt our public spheres, threatening long-term damage, suspending parliaments, taking away personal liberties in emergency periods. But for me, a particularly painful example is the freedom of expression. Throughout the world, we see a lot of autocratic governments who keep abusing COVID to crack down on the freedom of expression and to silence others. And this happens also in the very heart of Europe. A member of my party, Momentum, János Csókaszűcs, criticized the government's health policies on social media, and the local mayor ordered that half a dozen policemen turns up to his house at 6 a.m. and takes him into police custody. Just imagine the long-term chilling effect such images have, especially in a young democracy like ours. The way how it can intimidate people and how it suffocates opposition activism. But I believe that we have to be inspired by the example of János. After he was released, he fought to have the charges dropped against him, and he eventually won. And there was a solidarity protest in his favor, and there he said the following words, that it wasn't me that they wanted to intimidate, it was everyone else. But keep on going, and if you do, this will all be over much faster. So I think he is a very wise man to say that. I believe that the end of the Orbán government is in sight, and also the end of COVID is in sight, but we have a backlog here. We need to double down on our efforts to rebuild and reinvigorate our democracies. We cannot be complacent, and we need to go the extra mile, but we will do so because we are liberals, right?
Okay, well, it seems that all of you are pretty ambitious when it comes to 2050. In the coming 40 minutes, we'd like to explore a little bit more of how we can achieve that. Beatriz, we asked our audience, what is the main mission of the Liberals? And people have a difficulty choosing them because they're all very close together.
Indeed, but ever since we came back to the poll earlier today, I think the impact of the speeches of our speakers and also our keynotes has been very strong, because now safeguarding democracy is the top. Then it's very closely followed by equipping our authorities with the tools to fight the crisis while protecting our liberties. And this is very interesting because we have already quite some questions coming from the audience, and they are all related to this tension between ensuring that we fight the crisis and protecting our individual liberties, such as shouldn't be closing the borders a taboo, instead something that we only use in case of extreme emergencies and not something that we rely so much on, as we have seen over the past few months in Europe, not only with the COVID crisis, but even before. Or how should we avoid a two-tier society in Europe regarding those who are vaccinated and those who don't want to get vaccinated? And a very interesting question that we got from Liana Melker, who is the lockdown as a treatment damaged people as much as it damaged COVID. Now we face two challenges, COVID and a killed economy. How can we survive those two?
Oh, wow. Well, let's dive into that directly. The next question we're going to ask to you at home is, when we're going to talk about under which conditions are restrictions compatible with our liberal values, we want to know from you, what are the most important criteria for ensuring restrictions are compatible with liberal values? I want to hear some words from you. When we move to our panel, there's a lot of questions already coming from the audience. They understand we need restrictions. In a way, they even enable our freedoms, but also they endanger our freedoms. And we know once government have been giving measures of control, they're very unlikely to give them back at some point. So how do we make sure that all these measures are not endangering our freedoms too much? Ms. in 't Veld? So I can say Sophie, I've been told. I can say first names.
Indeed. So it's weekend, Sophie. No, this is a very delicate balance, but I think we should always start from the position that freedom should not be restricted unless. And I think we as citizens also have to be critical. And I would also encourage parliaments to be more critical, because I realize that in times of crisis for parliaments, it's not so easy to criticize the government, because the government is seen as the one that's going to protect us and to save us. But critical questions are necessary, and you don't have to be a crazy anti-vaxxer, COVID denier in order to ask critical questions. I also think that we should let's say, insist that any restriction of our freedom should be well justified. And of course, in the early stages of the COVID crisis, that was difficult because we didn't know what we were dealing with. But now we have a lot more information. We should be listening much more to the experts and justify every single measure. And I think Katka is right. It's once governments get a taste of having exceptional powers and largely unchecked. I mean, I can even feel it in the council where the 27 governments come together. When we were negotiating this COVID certificate, I could sense, the arrogance of powers. And I really deeply believe democracy is less about elections than it is about checks and balances, powers and countervailing powers, and that must be urgently restored.
Yeah, Evelina, this checks and balances and this feeling that we need to restore. You're in government. I can assume it's pretty handy when you have your hands untied by your parliament, so you can just do what is necessary in a crisis. How willing are governments to give those powers and freedoms back and reshare them?
I do believe that actually there are three main points which is so crucial to keep that balance. It's proportionality of our restrictions, deadlines of our restrictions, and of course, individualized approach of restriction. I do believe that it's very difficult for government, especially having a lot of powers in hands, to keep those questions on the table and to ask them, not only from the parliament, but by themselves as well, especially having those questions from society, keeping freedom of speech, to keep in mind when we have restriction, for example, even freedom of movement, to keep in mind that every special situation have to be have approach of individualized. For example, if a pregnant woman cannot come to any country but have a fiancé here, should we stick with restriction, for example, only for marriage couples? So to keep in mind that behind any restriction, behind any law, actually are people. So I guess that's main liberal values, and it's actually not only liberal values but human rights. So we keep in mind what are deadlines even for a green certificate. I mean, how long we would like to use it, and is there any base for those restrictions any longer? To keep those questions on the table, I would say main our arguments.
They're important values. Beatriz, in the meantime, the first values are appearing on our screen. What are the liberals saying?
Proportionality and transparency are the main words that we're having from our audience, but also communicating, making sure that the restrictions are temporary, that there is a parliamentary control, and as Sophie was saying, check and balances is also very important for our audience. But clearly, proportionality and transparency are the main things.
The main ones. Alexander, do all the liberal lawmakers in Europe have a list of liberal values on their desk to sometimes look at when they're discussing measures? Alexander?
Yes, hi. Well, I think the question was, when are restrictions okay? And I believe they are okay when they are the result of a real debate, a real negotiation in a society. And when at the end of the process, they are proportionate and fit for purpose. That is when they are okay. And I think all governments should have liberal values sitting on their table, to answer your question straight away.
And Katka, when we look at these measures, sometimes on paper they seem very proportional. Let's say for covering your mouth when you're in public, have a test when you're traveling. But when I arrived in Brussels yesterday, people were saying, oh, finally, after this week, we don't have to wear a mask outside. I feel so free. And when I travel back to the Netherlands tomorrow, I will go by a local train so I can avoid restrictions, having to get myself tested if I go with the big international train. Do sometimes the measures on paper look so much lighter than they are felt in reality?
Well, I believe it's very easy to consider something light, but when it is in the people's life every day, when it is a significant departure compared to the way how we used to live, even a small change can be perceived as a complete change of lifestyle. For instance, I was working as a doctor before. I had no problem wearing mask for like a 10-hour workday, but when it became really a part of my life, like every day, from morning to evening, in the shop, in the restaurant, everywhere, then it was like a bit different. So I think what Evelina said before, it is so important that behind every measure there are people, there are lives, there are families, there are routines. And when governments drop these measures, it's important not only to keep them in mind, but also to always consider what a possible way out can be, how long these measures last. And I think the end of these measures should not be perceived as something arbitrary. I think we have to set, as liberals, we believe in science, right? We have to set clear deadlines for phase out, scientific targets which have to be met, and afterwards we can ease. And this is how people will also trust us, that we treat them as adults, and they can clearly see what we do, how we do it, and approximately how long we keep on doing that.
Alexandru, I think citizens demand two things from you. First of all, they want from you the freedoms reinstated and as free as possible. At the same time, they also demand from you basically zero deaths, lower transmissions, and empty hospitals. How can you get this? How can you make sure that you keep the support of your citizens when their demands are so widely different?
From my point of view, our citizens are able to adapt to pandemic context. This has been demonstrated by the high degree of compliance with COVID protection measures. I'm talking about Romania now. At this moment, Romania is going through a period of relaxation as a result of accelerated decrease of the number of COVID-19 diseases, which was determined by the spread of the vaccination process and by the fact that our citizens mostly responded and understood the measures that deemed necessary to take in order to bring this crisis down. The streets, the parks, and the terraces have been revived. It is obvious that the population is tired and bored of staying home, and they missed interaction and socialization. And each wave of relaxation brings us closer to normality, to our way of life. I am convinced that our citizens understand the risks, have become accustomed to them, and thus able to overcome the anxiety generated by the current crisis. If we make an analysis of how each of us understood and acted at the beginning of the pandemic and how we look at it now, we would reach a reassuring conclusion, I think. We adapt easily when facing danger if we understand that the measures of protection and restrictions are in fact for our own good. History teaches us that health crises are cyclical, and normally from each crisis we go through, we must learn how to respond better to the next one. Obviously, the technological developments help us a lot in responding promptly and annihilating pandemic risks as quickly as possible. I strongly believe that we are coming out of this crisis stronger and more prepared for the future crises that we will have to face in the future.
Wonderful. And we're going to talk more about how we can prepare ourselves for the future, but we already touched upon it. Maybe the most philosophical question, how much risk avoidance can we have? We're going to talk about it, but first we have a few more words coming in.
Yes, indeed. So I found very interesting that one of the things that our audience was saying is don't panic. And that very clearly moves very nicely into the next pool, because we're going to talk about that, about not panicking and trying to assess what are the risks. And the question that we're launching today for you is actually, have you become more risk averse during the COVID-19 crisis? We want to hear from you, so make sure that you vote and we will bring the results.
More or less. So, let's say in medieval times, when the plague was hitting Europe, we just basically went on with our lives and we prayed for it to go away. It was part of life. Now we don't accept it. We see basically every death as a failure of government intervention. Have we gone too far in a risk-free society where all our tunnels need to have so many safety exits, where all our babies are monitored with cameras, and also we don't accept that maybe a pandemic is part of life, and we are willing to sacrifice so many liberties to avoid unnecessary deaths. Is it time for politics to bounce back and sometimes say to the population, we as government cannot protect you from everything? Who wants to go first?
Maybe
Katka?
I'd like to...
Yes. Well, of course, government cannot protect you from everything, but at least I think they should try, not from everything, but at least create a good governance framework which guarantees, your safety and shows a responsible conduct. And I think, of course, it's wrong to criticize governments for every death that's out there. They didn't cause the pandemic. But I think it's also very legitimate to voice reasonable criticism towards butchered policies, for instance. When the Hungarian government refused to order the next round of Pfizer vaccines because they said they just don't need them in Hungary, I think it's very legitimate that we say that it was a wrong step, or when countries kept on confiscating each other's PPEs, or I don't know. Also in Hungary, when they changed the laws for governing medical professionals in the middle of the pandemic, which caused the resignation wave, I think these are butchered measures. So of course, citizens have to be proportional, but governments also have to be mindful of the very outstanding responsibility they have in these trying times, when everybody is, of course, looking at the power, because this is where they are looking for solutions as well.
Yes, and Evelina, in the Netherlands, we had a minister of justice once going to parliament when a child in the care of the government unfortunately passed, and he said, well, these things sometimes happen. We try everything to avoid it, but we cannot we cannot have every child safe unless we all put them in a glass bowl like a hamster. This is also not something that we want. I choose liberty for the most over the safety of everybody sometimes. How much courage does it take for a minister to say such a thing?
I would say actually it's a great example of honesty. Actually, we need honesty from politicians as well, and especially from liberal politicians. Society actually expects us to say true, because as we already see during the pandemic, actually saying just don't panic, it doesn't work, because sometimes plans we have For example, in different countries, and Lithuania as well, when government have plans to stick to numbers of people in hospitals and then try to use restriction or, for example, go less with restriction, it doesn't work because you have a lot of different criteria. For example, vaccination. So the number of people in hospitals, maybe it's not number one. I mean, it's the situation actually changing so quickly. So for a politician to be honest and say sometimes it's only a political decision. I mean, if we keep only to experts, opinion of experts, I'm sure that every country in EU, at least most of them, have experts next to the government from medical saying what is the best for society, for public health. Actually, it's still the final decision is for politician. So to find that balance and saying that actually something, sometimes our plans can work greater, sometimes they can work less, but still we are doing our best and we trust in our society and we are responsible. I mean, I do believe that society hope from politicians to say that we are responsible for our political reasons and for our political plans and for our political decisions.
Beatriz, what is our audience saying?
Can I come in here?
First they go. Oh yeah, Alexander?
Yes, I think it's very important to recognize a society that promises total protection will, without ever saying so, sacrifice liberty, full stop. So anyone and everyone who makes that promise is ready to sacrifice our liberties, life chances, and opportunities. And I think that's the wrong way. I'll give you one example. We had this situation where couples, married couples, long-standing partnerships, same-sex, heterosexual, doesn't matter, could not see one another because of travel restrictions. Okay, some ministers said for protection reasons that is necessary. I found that a terrible infringement of liberty. I was very proud of the group to have started the campaign "Love is not tourism." And so I think this is a very good example of somebody exaggerating protection and sacrificing liberty.
Yes. And Sophie, should this be much an individual choice where people can say, okay, well, I choose some liberties and I accept the risk that comes with it? Or this is something where the government should say, everybody in society should take more or less the same amount of risk?
Well, the point is not just how much risk a person is willing to take for himself, but if you're posing a risk to the others. I mean, if in the case of a pandemic, you can transmit the disease to others. And you said, I hear somebody's microphone is open, I think.
But continue, please.
You said at the start that in the Middle Ages, when there was the plague, for example, that they didn't take any measures and just prayed. That's not true. Quarantine actually stems from that period. And of course, I think this is the big question that I also try to address in my opening remarks. I don't think that there is one objective measure. How do you measure risk, containing risk against freedoms? But I do think that we should give it some more thought. We have indeed become very risk averse. And if you ask the individual, do you want to run the risk of being killed in an attack or by a disease or whatever, they'll say no. At the same time, I have the feeling that we have been, in a very creeping process, we have been creating such a big, huge government with so many powers to intervene in our lives, and we're never asking the question anymore if that is what we want. If we want government to have such a big say over not just our individual lives, but also shaping society, because risk, we don't like risk, but freedom also comes with more creativity, more free thinkers. We need that a little bit in society as well to keep society healthy. So I do feel that we should be having this debate more often and not automatically say we want to eliminate all risk and we're always willing to sacrifice all freedoms for that.
That's clear. Beatriz, what does the audience say about their risk averseness?
Most of our audience indeed saw an increase in the risk averse over this crisis, although some other people just felt that it was neutral, that they didn't see a change in the way that they perceive those risks anyway. But most of them indeed were a little bit worried about what was going on in the world.
Wow.
Also, very quickly, I'm very sorry, but we want to hear from you as well. So if you have questions for our speakers, please share them with us. We would like to make you part of the conversation.
Okay, well, so moving on from the question, how risk-averse should we be? I even heard people a while ago saying we should disallow skiing because you can fall. I'm really glad we didn't come to that part so far. Let's move to the next question. I think this is a very crucial question in this debate. This is not the last pandemic. There will be, all virologists warn us, there will be more in the future and we need to be ready. We saw our governments had to basically panic now, so we need to find a way that when the next crisis comes, and maybe it's a virus, maybe it's something else, that our governments are well equipped to do it. At the same time, well, the easiest way is to just give them full authority over everything, but we also want to keep our democracy safe. So how can we give governments these tools that they need, but also bring them with safeguards? And also we ask the audience for some help. What do we ask them?
Indeed, we ask them what are the most important checks and balances to make sure that the emergency laws that we use in case of crisis are actually democratic.
Yes, so we want to hear checks and balances. Alexandru, what are the most important checks and balances to make sure that you as a government have the tools that you need?
Well, I think in crisis situation, there is a natural reflex in giving the government increased powers in order to create the capacity to react quickly to problems that arise. This mechanism is one that we find in legislations of all member states, and it is represented by the state of emergency and the state of alert situations, which are, of course, temporary. Returning to normality and practically ending the COVID-19 pandemic is a goal that must be achieved as soon as possible, but the progress must not be rushed, as we risk generating the return of a large number of cases of infections and practically prolonging the crisis in which we are. This is a reason why the lifting of restrictions must be done in stages and based on calculations and analysis by specialists. For the crisis of the future, we need to equip the government of the states with specific legislation that will allow them to act quickly, to reflect effectively, and to have the necessary tools for it. And we must think about ways to prevent populist tendencies, increasing popularity due to the necessary measures that must be taken in such extraordinary situations. Moreover, health systems must be prepared so that they can respond quickly to risk situations at any time. And I speak here of both the health system of every member state, but also about the common effort, the common instruments that allow us to be stronger together in front of any kind of threat, either it's natural or artificial.
Thank you so much. And then, Evelina, I think the two most important measures we can think of to do this is, one, have all measures be temporary. Then you can give governments full freedom, but it ends at a certain date, or you build in the checks and balances. But what we often see with temporary measures is that, well, we prolong it once, then we prolong it another time, and then creepingly it becomes a permanent measure. Should we be really wary of temporary measures without the right checks and balances being built in?
I do believe that we already mentioned. I mean, balance, it's one of the key points, but you have to stick with parliamentary control. When government actually can act very quickly to have meetings, actually not only on business days, to remember to come back to parliament and to answer all questions, not to be afraid to be criticized, which is very normal in democratic countries. And one of the key points, I would say, to have open meetings, especially when the government are acting very quickly, especially when we speak about any restriction, to ask all, for example, business, also open society, NGOs to come to discuss when you have any new restriction, especially when you try to prolong those restrictions. I mean, to have that healthy discussion is one of the key points, I would say, in our liberal democracy. And of course, to remember that cooperation between member states. It's very difficult for every country and for governmental as well to explain for society why one or other restriction actually are here in any country when we don't have cooperation on European level, we don't have common, for example, decision at least between our member states in our neighborhood. So I would say our unity and of course open discussion is key points here.
But this parliamentary scrutiny, I think in the Netherlands we had a minister for COVID measures who had a burnout, more or less, because he had to go to parliament so often for marathon debates with not always relevant questions, because parliamentarians were mainly profiling themselves. Aren't we expecting too much and maybe putting too much pressure on governments if they have to be in parliament all the time? Sophie, I saw you sighing.
Yes, the suggestion that the minister who literally keeled over when he was in parliament, that was because of the Dutch parliament being so critical is, yes, that's a funny suggestion. No, I actually think parliament should have been a lot more critical because, yes, they're asking a lot of questions, but at the same time I can see, and it's understandable, that parliaments are a bit reticent. They're a bit timid because they don't want to be seen to actually criticize or attack a government which is trying to manage a crisis. But that is, I think, a very dangerous development. And I'm chairing the so-called Democracy, Rule of Law and Fundamental Rights Monitoring Group in the European Parliament. We have been monitoring the impact of the COVID measures on democracy, the rule of law and fundamental rights pretty much from the start. And it's actually, if you see the full picture of what's happening, it's actually pretty scary. We're not only talking about, restricting our freedoms in terms of, free movement or wearing face masks. Indeed, as Katka said, freedom of expression, but also discrimination, direct or indirect, certain groups which have been hard hit. As Alexander said, the right to family life, which has in many cases unnecessarily been restricted, and that's quite dramatic if you've been separated from your loved ones for such a long time. The right to freedom of assembly, which has been restricted basically without a good justification, but in particular the functioning of parliaments, of courts, which has been heavily impacted, and there doesn't seem to be a sense of urgency in terms of we have to end that impact fast. I mean, everybody's focused on free movement, but restoring full parliamentary democracy, the separation of powers, rolling back the exceptional powers of governments, maybe even doing something like a parliamentary inquiry or assessment, let's say, of what's happened to learn for the next wave, which will indeed come. I think that's really, really crucial.
Yes, wonderful. Alexander, do you agree?
And citizens appreciate it. Yes, Rogier, it's very important what Sophie just said. Citizens appreciate it when you criticize. Don't be irresponsible. Don't go the way of the anti-vaxxers, the COVID deniers. Don't do that. I can give you the example from Germany. At the beginning of the crisis, we supported the government.
Alexander, your connection is crumbling. I think anti-democratic forces are trying to crumble your connection. We're coming back to you soon. Beatriz, parliamentary scrutiny is popular with our audience, but they also think about human rights.
Indeed, I think very much in line with what Sophie was saying. They care so much about the fact that those measures are in line with protecting fundamental rights, but also making sure that we have a parliamentary scrutiny. And also the question of being in line with constitutional law, communicating, transparency, all those things that we said before, and time limit as well is very important for our audience. We have a lot of questions coming from them too, and one of those questions is actually about how to make sure that those people whose right has been disproportionately infringed are actually protected. Do we have sufficient legal protection for those people indeed that has been affected by this measure? That's one of the questions that we have coming up. Also, a very important question that we haven't addressed yet is the impact of the lockdown on people's mental health and how they have been coping with these issues during the pandemic. They care a lot about how this has been impacting people's lives, and they want to hear from our speakers.
Katka, if you end up belly first in a hospital, it's very clear that you have a problem. But mental health and all these, it creeps on you. This is a slow crisis. How can we make sure that also slow crises are in the view of politicians and policymakers?
Well, first of all, I think we really have to talk about it a lot in the public. I have an MEP colleague from Hungary, from the socialist group, who was very open about his struggles with mental health during the pandemic. He even wrote a big op-ed on this. And I think coming outs like this are so important because in a lot of countries, mental health issues are still stigmatized. And a lot of people feel shame for admitting that they are suffering from depression or that they have problems that they cannot handle by their own. So I think, first of all, we need to be able to make people realize that they need help, and afterwards we need to provide them with the help. Because I think for me, handling the COVID pandemic is not over after all the new cases stop coming, but we also have to take the long effects, which include mental health. So we need to expand capacity and have the personnel ready for give help to everybody who needs it. Because if you think about it, a lot of people lost years from their lives. Students lost important benchmarks like the graduation ceremony.
How do you do it? How do you build in safety measures for slow crises, for things you don't see, and for marginalized groups that don't stand up for themselves?
It's also for me. Well, you know, you have a public health system, for instance, and you need to tweak it in a way to be more compatible with the challenges we have. For instance, you know, send psychologists more to schools. In Hungary, it's not really common to have it, or to combine it with the work our social workers are doing. A lot of different segments have to work together to get to these groups which are in a difficult position. That's why we need a good and coordinated government to take care of such issues. Yes. And also listening to the output from the public,
yes,
and NGOs and
Alexandru. When we make these measures, how can we build in the safety measures when we make the measures that we also have basically an emergency brake for when human rights or mental health is affected by it?
I think we all agree that everything has to be proportional. I think that we have to talk about these things and to help the ones that are in need. I'm not sure that we have all the facts now, and knowing how many people are affected about the crisis mentally, I mean. And I think from now on we'll have to connect with them to communicate and to create public programs. And we will do so by investing money in these programs. With human rights, I think the proportionality system and balancing this with our judicial systems is the only solution. I think our judicial systems are prepared to do that. I've seen here in Romania cases and that rule against some of the governmental rulings. So I think the judicial system, if will do its part and will sanction every wrongdoing of the government.
Clear, thank you. Beatriz?
We have a very interesting question coming from the audience, because we have been talking a lot about how democracy can be affected by these restrictions. But one of the questions is to what extent democracy has actually been weakened by the misunderstanding between policymakers and researchers, and to what extent this falsification versus actual decisions has been affected by this. And I was wondering maybe also as well fake news, which is a question that I know is very close to the heart of some of our speakers.
Yes. Okay, who would like to pick up this question? Alexander?
I hope my connection is a little bit better now.
Yes.
I think that has been a big issue in our national debate, but in many debates across Europe. And I think to re-establish the trust between the public authorities, and the scientific community, who all communicate to their own rules, is going to be crucial, because the scientific community does not always have consensus on everything. That would be a misunderstanding. And some people have engaged in spreading fake news about this study or that study, positioning it as if it was the final and only truth. That is never the case with scientific research. However, when you have a large consensus emerging, like climate change, for example, then public authorities should be clear that they follow the science. And this is something that we, I think, need to re-strengthen after the pandemic.
Yes. Evelina, the whole discussion about the rule of law was basically already there, and tying that to budgets and other things and really make the European Commission bite and not bark anymore is a discussion from before the COVID crisis. It got stronger during the COVID crisis. How will be the aftermath? Will we all forget about it, or has COVID really marked a moment in our agenda that we think we will not let this happen?
I'm almost sure that already what we mentioned, not only in the question, what Vera Jourová already mentioned about rule of law and special report, it's one of the bases to discuss. I mean, do they have all those mechanisms actually which can help our society to make sure that the restriction of the government, it doesn't matter is it the pandemic time or just a regular time, actually can be went to the court proceeding and to have actually to check the balance of a governmental restriction and the proportionality. What already have been mentioned, and I guess it's very key point of this discussion, the democracy. I mean, I don't believe that actually the pandemic is a threat from democracy, because what we can see in all member states, society now, even though that sometimes it's misinterpretation, sometimes it's disinformation, the society are more active to discuss, to even to be active in demonstration. I mean, the biggest challenge for governmental as well for EU, I do believe, what we're already doing is searching for answer, have to have common approach about disinformation, about hate speech and hate crimes, because it's key point for us how to keep information which comes from government, from EU, stable. And actually, I would do believe that it have to be done through debates, but still we have to have legal system, democratic and independent legal system, finding the balance between freedom of expression. Disinformation as well as hate speech is not a part of freedom of speech.
Okay, well, thank you. The vaccinations are coming. Our societies are going to be reopened. Also, our polling stations will be reopened in the coming years. And you as liberals will have to go to the voters and say, we want your trust. And when they ask you about our democracies and our freedoms, what is the promise of the liberals? That is the question we would like to end this debate with. Beatriz, we're also asking this to our audience. What are the first responses coming in?
We are indeed asking the question to the audience, and here we have very much the same question. They want to find a balance between individuals' liberties and democracy. One of the things that they are saying is that we want to have more personal responsibility, less involvement of the government indeed, but there has to be a balance between the two.
Okay, well, keep sending in what you think should be the liberal promise for liberals around Europe to gain and regain and gain more trust of the citizens, that our freedoms and democracies are in the safe hands with the liberals and maybe only with the liberals. Evelina, what would you say? What is the promise of the liberals for Europe?
Actually, for me, it's easier question because we have election in Lithuania only in 3 years, so enough time to regain all trust from society. But coming back to the question, I would say there are three main key pillars: economy, education, and human rights. It's all linked and it's connected together. When we speak about the democracy, liberal rights, and about human rights, actually it cannot be done without the education, and without economy, we cannot come back to the economy we had before the restriction we had before. So I would say keep with liberal rights, with human rights, and to keep together with education and economy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Alexandru, what would you say is the promise of the liberals?
Well, our liberal approach focuses on individual rights of citizens. To ensure this, we need a justice system that is able to respond immediately and swiftly sanction any violation of these rights and freedoms. However, this liberal philosophy seems to fade in the event of a crisis in which a number of rights and freedoms are restricted. But we have to see the whole context, I think. The restrictions of rights intend to respond to a risk posed by COVID-19 crisis. And if we respect the democratic standards where governments have earned and exceeded the limits, the judicial system in the member states have reacted and corrected these exaggerations. This is also, I think, the liberal promise that we have to make when it comes to democracy, civil rights and freedoms. Whenever the executive is wrong, when it exceeds its constitutional limits and the rule of law, justice can intervene quickly to correct these imbalances. This is, I think, how it should look our promise.
It should be our promise. And Alexander, what would be your promise?
Well, the liberal approach is to tell people, dream big and live your dream. I think this is what has not been possible for so many months now, a year and a half nearly, as individuals, as couples, as families, as professionals. I mean, we could do so little. And now it's the time to start dreaming again and living your dreams. I think it can be a small dream, it can be a big dream, that's up to you. But living your dreams, that's our promise. And the political promise, and that was where my connection was bad last time, when you criticize the government and do it responsibly, it pays off. The German liberals have doubled in the polls since we decided to take that course. So there's a recipe for success here for liberal politicians as well.
Look, a recipe for success. Sophie, yeah, also successful in elections in the Netherlands. What would you say is the promise of the liberals?
Well, I would like to, I'm not going to campaign here, but I would like to say one thing. We liberals, I think we all fight for freedom. Freedom is one of the key concepts. But strangely, we rarely ever speak out on equality. We kind of leave that to the left-wing parties, but it's not their monopoly. I think freedom and equality are two sides of the same coin. We cannot have freedom if we don't have equality for all. And I think one of the things that this COVID crisis has highlighted or really put the spotlight on is the inequality in society and how inequality quite literally kills. And I think we've seen Me Too, we've seen Black Lives Matter, and now we see the social inequalities and the economic inequalities in society. So I think if we marry freedom, liberalism, and equality, I think then we have the best proposition to the voters in years and decades to come.
But if you take up equality also maybe a little bit from the left, I think that a lot of parties on the left have also taken liberty onto them. What makes liberals stand out?
But I don't think the left has embraced freedom in the way that we have. They still think that they have some goals like solidarity, equality, which I fully share. But freedom for them is much less. How do you say it? Is much less of an objective. And I think freedom, equality, diversity, they all go together and they make a vibrant society. And we've seen many totalitarian regimes from the right, many totalitarian regimes from the left, but we've actually not seen any liberal totalitarian regimes. And I think societies which are free and open are the best societies to live in.
The best ones. Katka, what would you say we can promise to the citizens?
Well, I think we can promise the past more than hundreds of years of fight for rights and civil liberties to continue, because I think in the wake of the pandemic, it's even much more important to reflect on what we achieved so far in the areas of civil rights, gender rights, minority rights, but also to realize that this fight is not over. And we have to continue this two-front battle in this very difficult situation, that we have to fight the creeping authoritarian tendencies. We have to fight for civil rights, but also we have to fight for to end this horrible pandemic. And I think history of liberals really has the person in the core of it, and we just need to put more emphasis on the individual in these very trying times so that we can get our lives back in a responsible way.
Beatriz, are these promises in line with what the audience would like to hear?
Absolutely. Although I think they're way more philosophical than what our audience is sharing with us, they will be very happy to hear about this because they worry so much about the long-term impact of COVID. But the way they answer this question is very interesting to look. So you asked me what should be the liberal promise to protect our democracies and freedoms. And my answer, to decide as much as possible about my own life and I have the liberty to work and live without the state controlling and mingling much. Or put it more blindly by one of our viewers, less sinister, nanny state, more transparency and discussion.
I see 5 nodding people in our panel. Do we have more questions open?
No, we don't.
We don't. Okay, then we're gonna wrap this up. And I think you got our liberal hearts racing a little bit with your emphasis on freedom, transparency, and liberties that the liberals could bring to us, and show also how the liberals can stand out in the promises they make to European citizens and keep our citizens safe, keep our democracy safe, and find the right balance between all the liberties that we have to defend. I want to thank you so much and also wish you good luck in continuing this mission in the coming years that will probably have a lot of upsides, but also downsides. Good luck with your mission. Thank you so much. And before we wrap up the debate, we're going to listen to the European Commissioner for Justice, who's going to explain what the European Commission has been done to reinstall and safeguard our freedoms, and what is his plans for the future. Here's Didier Reynders.
Dear member of the ALDE family, I'm delighted to address our liberal family on the occasion of this year's party congress. Unfortunately, due to the sanitary situation, we have to gather virtually this year. Having to interact through screens has been one of the main characteristics of the past 15 months, but it is, of course, far from being the only consequence of the pandemic. I'm glad to see that the agenda of our party congress includes this session, devoted to the impact of the sanitary crisis on democracies and freedoms. As European Commissioner in charge of justice, the rule of law, data protection, consumer protection, and free movement of citizens within the European Union, I have witnessed firsthand how the virus and the measures put in place to contain it have impacted our fundamental freedoms. Of course, governments need to take the necessary measures to protect public health. But the Commission has insisted from the beginning that responses must respect our fundamental values. The Commission has been monitoring the emergency measures taken and has insisted that they should be limited to what is necessary, strictly proportionate, and clearly limited in time. And it is of great importance that governments ensure that such measures are subject to parliamentary scrutiny in full respect of democratic checks and balances. Our monitoring has been reflected in the first annual Rule of Law report published in September last year. The report highlighted that effective decision-making cannot mean bypassing established checks and balances, such as national parliaments, and that national courts often played a key role in reviewing the measures taken. I'm glad to highlight that I'm now preparing the second Rule of Law report in view of its publication in July. Another note, the COVID-19 pandemic has also had a devastating impact on free movement of people within the European Union. And we have a long road beyond us in terms of fostering coordination among member states to lift barriers to free movement, which is a fundamental right. I have worked very hard to this end, and I will continue to do so. We need to ensure a safe return to free movement without unnecessary restrictions and with utmost regard to fundamental rights, including the protection of public health, of personal data, and non-discrimination. The EU Digital COVID Certificate is the crucial piece of the puzzle in this context. Right after the European Council of March, President von der Leyen tasked me with this important file, and 2 months and a half later, I'm glad that the proposal of the Commission has been approved by the co-legislators. This framework will encompass vaccination certificates, but also test and recovery certificates, and will be issued free of charge. It will enter into force on the 1st of July. The certificate will provide EU citizens with a reliable and safe tool when traveling, and member states with a trusted framework to verify certificates issued by other member states. The entire process is well underway, also thanks to the quick adoption of the regulation by the European Parliament this week, with some member states already issuing and verifying certificates. To make the best use of this certificate, the Commission also proposed to update the Council recommendation on the coordination of free movement restrictions within the European Union to provide the necessary clarity for holders of such certificates. Member states should gradually ease free movement restrictions and coordinate this gradual lifting, notably for holders of an EU digital COVID certificate. We basically recommend that holders of a certificate should not be subject to additional travel restriction, such as quarantine. I believe that we can look with satisfaction on how we managed to come with such a tool so swiftly, and I must say that our Liberal family has played a key role in this file. There is now hope on the horizon, as better days are coming. We must return to a normal balance of power, and citizens must fully regain their rights and freedoms. I thank you for your invitation, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of you again physically as soon as possible.
Let's hope indeed for that return of liberties and freedoms. Indeed. Thank you so much, Commissioner, for those words. That's it from us from today, but now we're going to get into a break. But make sure that if you haven't yet voted for the candidates for the bureau of the ALDE party, 3 vice presidents and the treasurer, you have to do it now because you have just 1 hour left to do it. And what's coming next?
Yeah, and make sure that when you're voting, you stay logged on, because at 1:30 we continue with voting for all the resolutions. You need to be logged in for that so you can vote. So when you vote for your favorite candidate, make sure you stay logged in and vote for the resolutions. And afterwards, then we'll have our closing session. We have speeches of our co-presidents. So there's a lot more to come, but I think lunch is important.
It is indeed. Thank you so much for being here today with us, and see you soon.
Goodbye.